is Bean to Barstool, a podcast that looks at the intersections of craft beer and craft chocolate. My name is David Nilsson. I'm a professional beer writer and an advanced cicerone, and the creator and host of this show. The music for this episode is by my dear friend, indie folk musician Anna P.S. You can find out more about Anna's music in the show notes or at her website, annapsmusic.com. You can find links and information about our guests in the show notes as well. I hope you enjoy this episode of Bean to Barstool. I never come away from a conversation with cacao agronomist Sarah Bharath without learning something, and it's probably because Sarah never comes away from anything without learning. Her curiosity and excitement to learn drive the very important work she does working with cacao farmers to better understand the ecosystems of their cacao farms, how to work with the land and its resident microbes, and how to adapt fermentation practices to a changing environment and climate. No piece of accepted wisdom is sacrosanct in Sarah's approach to learning and, in turn, teaching. We must examine everything we think we know, at all times prepared to explore new perspectives and yield to new evidence. For Sarah, learning and teaching form a symbiotic relationship, each thriving best in the other's company. Sarah's been on the show before. You first heard from her last winter on an episode with Chris Heier of Half-Hitch Brewing. Chris brewed a beer and made some chocolate with cacao from Trinidad, where Sarah is based. She came back on the show for one of the most popular episodes of 2023 to talk about cacao fermentation. If you want to learn more about fermentation and how it influences chocolate flavor, that's a great place to start. I'll link to both of those episodes in the show notes. Since then, Sarah and I have regularly bounced ideas off each other, and we periodically hop on Zoom calls to discuss what we're excited or curious about. We decided to share the latest of those conversations with you today, and if you enjoy this, maybe we'll do so more often, so let us know. In this conversation, we start out talking about Cacao Lavado, or unfermented cacao, something Sarah posted about on her Instagram account recently. It's a perfect example of how Sarah approaches topics. Cacao has to be fermented, right? Sure, except when it doesn't, and how do you know when that is unless you break an accepted rule and experiment? One quick note before we jump in for folks who are maybe new to craft chocolate. Sarah at one point mentions CCN 51 cacao. CCN 51 is a cacao variety developed in the 1970s that is often hardier and higher yielding than many heirloom varieties. Those qualities, its critics say, come at the cost of flavor diversity. There are valid points made from all sides, so if this rabbit trail is of interest to you, I encourage you to do some Googling to learn more about it. Let's hear from Sarah about Cacao Lavado and the nature of learning. One thing that I want to talk about is unfermented cacao, because you put up a post about this not long ago, and the last major conversation we had, I think, was all about fermentation. And so fermentation is necessary, and then you put up this post that apparently it's not. So now I'm back to being confused. Tell me about unfermented cacao.
I'm sorry, David. I'm sorry. But here we are. They seem to be very opposed things that I might have said, but they're both true. They can both exist in time and space at the same time. Everything, everywhere, all at once. Okay, so I'm glad you've brought this up, actually, because it's something that I spoke about at length during one of my most recent training missions in Jamaica, where we were looking at why should we ferment cacao? Right? Why should we not ferment cacao? At the end of the day, what is done to this seed all depends on what do you want to get out of it, right? What are we after? So what's the end game? That's what I call it, right? What's the end game? And if your end game is to explore the fullest flavor potential of this bean in a way that allows you to make palatable eating chocolate, notice what I'm saying, eating chocolate, right? Then it requires handling in a particular way to be able to, one, reduce the bitterness and astringency where applicable, all right? Because not all varietals will need you to necessarily bring that bitterness and astringency down, okay? For the purple bean varieties, because I'm really trying to avoid saying forastero, but there I said it. So classically has been termed the Forastero varieties, your dark, your pigmented. Yes, that's the correct way to say it. The pigmented varieties, they, depending on the degree and the intensity of pigmentation, it's normally linked with an increase in the astringency and the bitterness because of the compounds that are involved in the presence of those pigments, right? Whereas the white bean varieties tend to have way less astringency and bitterness, okay? Now, with fermented cacao beans, we're aiming to basically lower the volume, lower the intensity on the things that make the seeds a whole lot less palatable. And we're looking to ramp up, i.e. turn up the volume now, turn up the intensity on the good stuff. And that good stuff, well, always includes actually how much more of a chocolate note can we coax out of this seed based on its genetics and all of the other attendant things in terms of how it was handled in the growing environment, and then finally how it was processed, right? Because it's a combination of things. It's an interplay of things that allow us to explore the flavor potential of the seed, right? It's not genetics just represents one dimension, just one dimension. So if we're after that fully flavorful product in terms of chocolate, and then if we're dealing with varietals that lend themselves to the expression of additional flavor notes, what they call ancillary notes, you will see that written in some, in journal articles and stuff. Some people refer to it as special notes. That's what gives the additional flavor beyond chocolate, right? If you're after all of that, then yes, you do want to ferment that seed, okay? If you're after having the expression of the acidity that tends to be linked to fruity flavors and the expression of fruity flavors, and for those people who like a bean after it's been processed for their chocolate, they like that nice punchy acidic note because of what they can do with it, then you must ferment the bean, yes? And different ways of handling that fermentation process, number of turns, the amount of time that it's sitting in that fermentation vessel exposed to basically marinating in that acid can influence the amount of acidity that is expressed. And then drying allows you to fine tune that by either allowing you to trap the acid inside the bean, or you can choose to drive as much out of it as possible with very, very focused drying regimes, right? Again, that is all dependent on the desired end product. However, if you're after a beverage that is not acidic in nature, yes, if you're after a beverage that is seeking to go after, let's say, less processed ingredients from that seed, right? Closer to, I don't want to say raw, because it's not exactly raw. But the point is, it's less processed than a fully fermented seed, okay? You want to get at those flavors that are very much tied to the genetics of that bean. You either leave it unfermented or you work with it in an under-fermented capacity. Now, this makes me want to qualify something right away. It's something many of us as workers in the space, we've been saying for quite some time to help folks understand that the pulp of the fruit is what is fermented. The pulp of the seed, yes? That is what is fermented. So when folks say that, okay, it's under fermented, the seed is under fermented, I usually have a split in my brain. Like, what do they mean by it's under fermented? Because the industry at large, we use fermentation of the seed or fermented seed to refer to the entire process, i.e. the pulp fermentation, as well as the internal biochemical and chemical reactions that are not fermentation reactions. Yes? So this is where the confusion happens now for a lot of people. When I say it's under fermented and then they taste it and they're like, but this is not under fermented. And I'm like, it depends on how it was handled. Yes? Because with under fermented cacao, there are a number of things using the science of the process. You can tweak a number of things that will allow the inside of that seed to open up in a way that you would normally find with a fully fermented seed. You can have the same kind of oxidative browning that happens inside that seed. So when you section the seed through, and you're to look at it, let's say through a conventional cut test, you're like, but this looks like a beautifully fermented seed. It's going to taste amazing. And then you taste it and it's hell in a spoon, okay? Because the astringency is still almost close to 100. The bitterness is just as high, but you're like, but the seeds were 100% brown. And that is where now I started recognizing that in the industry, we have associated this brown color with a chocolate flavor. And this is one of the limitations that has been highlighted for a long time. We all know that the cut test is limited. Nobody's saying no, but the cut test is a very useful test for the parameters that we outline that we're going to use it for. It should not be extrapolated, right? But in working with unfermented, underfermented cacao, it gave me a way to understand why the industry was saying certain things. It gave me a way to understand how we could be fooled into thinking that this X is X when X is really Y. Yes. So for me, the unfermented, underfermented status, it not only gave me a look at, there are all these other flavors that I didn't know anything about in cocoa, right? And I really, really, every single time, I think you've seen it on Instagram, but for me, it was such an opening of a door that I didn't even know existed, that I always have to give credit to the young Mexican chocolate maker, Mariana Garces, who introduced me to it. It was during a training session, virtual training session. I think this was during COVID with Chocolate Alliance. And she said to me, she said, have you ever worked with Cacao Lavado? And I'm like, no, I wouldn't dare do that with the varieties that we have in Trinidad, because our varieties are so aggressively astringent and bitter because of the parental genetics in some of the varieties, right? Why would I even think of doing that? And she very gently said to me, I think you should do this. I think you need to look in this direction because it's going to help you explore the hidden flavors of cacao. David, that's all she needed to say. The Pandora's box was, it piqued my attention immediately because one, it took me out of the fermentation box, which is what I love, okay? But it brought me right back to the fermentation box because it helped me understand the whys of what we were doing. Yes. And now it gave me this parallel trip to be on, like, oh my God, this is crazy. So different varieties now, we get an opportunity to explore them in multiple ways without all of the symphony that's taking place due to, microbial contributions to the fermented flavors, the genetics and the flavor expressions, the inherent aromas that exist there. And then, of course, what happens during drying because of that fermented scenario. It gives me a much different landscape to explore. It gives us all a very different landscape to explore, but it's one that needs to be explored through beverages. And that is what really excites me because it opens up I won't say a whole new market, because that will just be unfair to the entire history of consumption of cacao from the very beginning, when it wasn't eating chocolate. It was drinking chocolate. It was drinking cocoa, right? It was drinking cacao, right? So I really see it giving us all a chance to now step back and take a look at something that we thought we knew, but it's like, wait, no, I have something else to show you. And the landscape, the diversity is mind-boggling.
We'll be right back.
Hey everyone, Final Gravity Issue 5 is now available in the shop on beantobarstool.com. This 5th issue of our zine telling personal, human-centered stories from the world of beer is full of great articles. Bono Segudu tells the story of the South African beer style Umkombothi, poignantly explaining its role in her culture and the importance in her family's celebrations and milestones. Maria Krugliak writes about discovering the Portuguese half pint after moving to Portugal during the COVID-19 pandemic. Amanda Bruns and Obakeng Malope discuss the water spirit Mamuhaswa and the collaboration beer they brewed in her honor. These and numerous other stories fill the 56 pages of this zine. We've expanded it and added a few features for this issue. It's full color, full of lots of beautiful photography and art. Definitely check this out. It's on beantobarstool.com/shop. You can purchase this issue or subscribe, and you can always support us on Patreon and get extra perks as well. Cheers. I can see why this is fascinating from a research standpoint. And you've just addressed this a little bit with the beverage, but can you talk about what the value proposition is on the consumer side? Like, why do this in terms of the finished product? What's going to be the benefit of doing it this way? It's obviously fascinating just to understand cacao better, but
Yeah, excellent question. And I don't even know if I have an answer for that, David, because I'm not a I'm not a marketing person per se. I'm not the kind to see the opportunities in particular product development. But what I can say, at least, and this is purely obviously anecdotal because it's just me and my experiences, right? But when I started working with and under fermented cacao, so basically Cacao Lavado, and then different iterations of under fermentation, and tasting each of these iterations, recognizing the differences not only in flavor profiles, right? Recognizing the differences in how it made my body physically feel. I have gone from being a fermented cacao hot chocolate drinker to my regular routine now is with unfermented or under-fermented cacao. I mean, granted, I have a higher tolerance for bitter than most. I certainly have a higher tolerance than I did long before I started working with cacao, okay? But some of the iterations that I have worked on, I've found a way to bring the bitterness and the astringency down, not to the same level as you would with fermented cacao, obviously, right? But at least moving the needle a bit enough so that when it's in beverage format, especially depending on what it's combined with, you can actually attenuate that the intensity of the bitterness and the astringency, right? But my body, I can tell you from consistent use now for the last at least 1.5 to 2 years, my body responds to it completely differently relative to fermented cacao. My body almost rejects the acidity that comes from fermented cacao. Yes, in terms of in a beverage form, okay? Which I found really strange, okay? But I'm just, like I said, I'm using myself as the canvas on which to try a few things, right? But I will say this, in the same way that we have come to use single origin craft chocolate experiences to help people begin to understand the diversity that cacao has, right? To understand what is going on at origin, to at least begin to be aware of what's going on. Okay, I'm not going to assume that everybody understands. It all depends on how deep you choose to go with this, right? And how interested you are. In the same way that we've been using the fermented cacao versions in the edible field, right? In the eating chocolate domain to teach, to share, to educate about a number of things. Great. We now have this parallel experience for people who are not into eating chocolate. They're not interested in a bar of chocolate. It's not how they enjoy cacao, right? For example, the rage with drinks and sorbets and experimenting with cacao pulp has become a thing. Yes, it should have been a thing from a long time ago, but I'll take what we can get right now. If we can do that with pulp, right now, the bulk of the pulp that's available is largely confined to one particular variety, right? Because that variety lends itself now to being depulped, and you can still use the seeds for fermentation. I mean, it's amazing. CCN 51 is just, it's phenomenal. I love it. I love it, okay? But can you imagine if we were able to introduce the rest of the world to the different flavors of cacao pulp. We can introduce them to the different flavors of unfermented cacao in a way that also shares that landscape of this is the staggering diversity that cacao can bring to this space. This is what is happening at origin. I mean, there's so much opportunity from the consumer education point of view. It may not hit mainstream as, let's say, a branded product. For me, sorry, that might be okay. It may be something that may initially be confined to simply being used as a teaching tool. But if that's where it has to start, let it start there. Yes, because there's so much that is unknown, misunderstood in the space with cacao, that if we have an opportunity through multiple parts and forms of this fruit, this seed, to begin to tell a more complete story about cacao, diversity, origins, its place and space in an ecosystem, what else it's working with to be able to build itself, to be able to develop certain things. My God, for me, it's a no-brainer, right? So it may be very biased of me. It is very biased of me. Let me just call a spade, to be thinking just along the lines of teaching. But I will say this, given my work with the Microlot project, right, and what Meridian and I have been able to achieve very, very simply using fermented cacao and chocolate as the teaching tool to have folks understand that no location has a single flavor profile. How much more can be done now if we actually begin to open people's minds to, hold on, you may not have a lot to be able to ferment, but you can definitely process it this particular way to get an acceptable unfermented or underfermented product that you can now partake from, that you can share. So from a farmer point of view, for me, it has an immediate relevance because it means material does not have to go to waste at the end of a crop cycle where it's drips and drabs. Yes. Mm-hmm. And you're like, well, it's not enough to be able to collect to ferment. Nobody's going to buy it. It's there for you. You as the producer should be able to partake of this greatness that you helped craft, right? Why not? So, I mean, I know it likely will need other people to sit with this. And that's why I'm happy to throw it out into the space, because I'm not here to think of all the ideas, right? That's not the point. I just really like being able to see where the possibilities are, put it out there, and let other people magnify it. So for me, the teaching opportunities, because of the angle from which, or the angles from which I come at this space, the teaching opportunities are massive.
We'll be right back.
Hey everyone, my book on pairing craft beer and craft chocolate is available now on Amazon and on the Bean to Barstool shop. Pairing Beer and Chocolate, a guide to bringing the flavors of craft beer and craft chocolate together, is out now. This paperback book explains the process of pairing beer and chocolate, includes a guide to hosting a pairing at home, walks through dozens of beer styles to provide style-by-style pairing guidance, and gives room for taking your own pairing notes along the way. This is the only book on pairing beer and chocolate available. Grab your copy now at the link in the show notes or on Amazon. If you manage a tap room, bookstore, chocolate shop, or cafe and want to stock the book, get in touch about our easy wholesale process. Beer and chocolate belong together, and this book is your guide to getting the most out of every pairing. Was there a point historically with indigenous groups where we know that these drinks were being made with unfermented cacao? And if so, was there a point where we saw that switch over to fermentation?
I cannot say from the literature if there's documentation when that switch actually happened, right? Because I've been trying to find something where we can actually point to when did the first fermentation actually happen, right? And to date, I've not seen anything. Folks have, who've written books have actually made reference to the fact that we don't really know when the first fermented products actually started, right? And who was responsible and all of that good stuff. So I can't tell you if there was a hard line, which era, but definitely in cultures, even to date, in a lot of these cultures where cacao has been it's been so much a part of their actual life. Their very being is centered around this, right? Mexico is a huge one, right? And so I think it's only fitting that Mariana was the person who brought this to me from Mexico, right? It's a way of life. It's a way of life. So the historical accounts, as far as I know, they abound with respect to how cacao was being consumed as a beverage. It would have been mixed with other things to make it more palatable, which to me suggested that it was largely under fermented, right? So you're bitter and you're astringent. So they made it more palatable. Apparently not enough for the Spanish, and the others who had to wait for the arrival of sugar, right? But even that part of it, David, that repeated mention of it being combined with other things, not just to make it palatable, but it made it an even more comprehensive and potent energy drink that was used in these cultures, these very, very connected to the land community cultures, right? I think there's a lot that can be mined from that simple concept of they mixed it with other things. For me, it brings full circle what we're hoping to do, we the collective on the planet, with this crop. And, when we talk about diversification and having all these other things in the space and having all of these other inclusions, we've been doing it with chocolate, with finished chocolate. You see the obsession, that's with all of the inclusions. And I see the brewing conversations around, with all of these inclusions in chocolate now, and the fact that consumers want these inclusions. Are we going to lose the opportunity to be able to talk about or showcase, single origin, 2 ingredient? Are we back to masking what cacao has to show to us? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. Why does it have to be a case of either or, 0, 1? It could be and. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Because cacao, I keep saying this everywhere I go, cacao it has never grown alone. It's not meant to grow alone. And when I saw, every time I see the references to it being consumed as a drink that had all of these other spices and all of these amazing things that grow with cacao, fortifying this already powerful drink, for me, it unifies everything. It unifies everything. So for me, cacao just continues to show us that, yes, I could be singled out as the star of the show, but I'm never meant to be the star of the show, because I am all about working with what else is there. I'm meant to be combined. I'm meant to grow with other things, because it's the being greater than the sum of the parts. That is what cacao has shown me, right? And I see it with Lavado. I see the opportunity to see it for what it is, as its own genetic, combination there, and fine, you appreciate that. But then when you put it with other things, you're like, oh my God, this is so much more than I thought it could have been. But it doesn't detract from what cacao can bring to the space. And it does not detract from what the other plants, fruits, etc. are bringing to the space as well. But when we bring them together now, it's a force of unparalleled proportions, right? So I think there are a lot of lessons in there for us.
You addressed this a little bit. Can you very briefly re-summarize why this isn't really applicable to solid eating chocolate?
Because of how aggressively astringent and bitter it is, and the lower level development, if any at all, of that chocolate flavor that we're after. Anecdotal references again. Everyone that I have managed to assault with offerings of the Lavado iterations that I've done, right? At first, the reactions have been, even prior to tasting, because of how we've been conditioned to think about unfermented cacao. Oh God, this is going to be really bad. Oh God, this is going to be hideously bitter, astringent, etc., etc. And it's comments like those coming off of some of the iterations that pushed me to develop further iterations, right? To see what could be tweaked, etc. But when as I've moved along the iterations and I've had folks taste the progression, the response has been unanimous. Oh my goodness, I never thought this could taste as good as it does, because they've learned to now separate what fermented cacao, hot chocolate tastes like. You judge this on its own merit. Yes, you judge it on its own merit. And folks that I thought would never be willing to try it without any kind of, whether it's milk, whether it's dairy or a non-dairy option, to help combine with the astringent, the molecules that are responsible for the astringency. So it attenuates it quite a bit, but it helps to now amplify the other flavors that are in that space. Yes, everyone hands down has been like, oh my God, what is this?
Yeah, I want to taste it so bad now. You've been talking about it. I'm fascinated.
I'm going to ship you some material.
Okay.
Okay, because I want you to try it for yourself. And I will give you suggestions on having it just as a hot steep so that you taste it without anything else. And then you begin to dose it with anything else you want to add. One of my most favorite combinations, I don't know if I mentioned this to you, and I can't remember if I threw it up onto Instagram, but one year when I'd gone over to Meridian, it was around Christmas time, and I actually had the opportunity to make a brew of it, right? It was a 1-to-1 ratio of the steeped Lavado. Okay, so I did the shavings in water, brought it to a boil, filtered it, yes, because you do have bits and pieces that you need to take out of there. And then I added some beautifully aged habanero pepper graspa to it, and just enough milk just to discolor the brew. I have the ratios written down somewhere, but David, oh my God, I will have to make it for you. That is my personal mission. I have got to make that for you. It is now the go-to winter drink, because you have the cacao, you have that flavor. We started getting honey notes. You were getting all of these interesting floral notes that I'd never picked up in cacao before. Yes. And then because with that touch of milk, it just brought the astringency and bitterness down enough to balance what we were tasting. And then because the graspa was aged with Trinidad habanero peppers, right? Fabulous product, not for sale. It was a homemade product, right? But beautifully aged. And it combined so well. David, words will not just do it justice. I have got to make it, and I've got to have you try it. That's the only way. You will then assess it. But
I will hold you to that, but I'm afraid that anybody listening is just going to get increasingly angry as they hear us talking about this and not getting to taste it.
Maybe we can end it there. But let's just say it opens itself up to a lot of combinations. Again, what I love about cacao, working with cacao, fermented and otherwise, is the fact that you can choose to be Puritan about it, and that's okay. Yes, you want to consume it just as is. I don't do dairy, or it has to be, a non-dairy option. It has to be just water, with whatever you choose. It's a democracy, okay? You do whatever works for you, because it's all about the flavor exploration, okay? It's a very, very personal thing. But when it comes to cacao, more and more, I keep seeing how much it just lends itself to, I want to be combined with something else. And actually, in saying this to you, it brings me back to the whole issue of cacao being just naturally an outcrosser. It wants to be crossed with other things, with other cacao varieties. It's not meant to be this pure standalone. Yes, there are some varieties that are as close to homozygous as you can get, right? But they're in the minority. At least that's what the genetics have shown to date, right? So as I've said before, there are a lot of lessons that continue to be revealed in there that we keep blowing past, because we're so determined the product needs to be this. And then the industry goes down this rabbit hole with blinders on that it has to be this. First, it was European style chocolate. Mm-hmm. And then the Americans thankfully bucked the tide. Craft chocolate came in and it's like, it doesn't have to be this. It can be something like, but it doesn't have to be this. And now more and more we're seeing, folks are innovating and inventing and just pushing the limits. But what limits? You know what I'm saying? We're the ones who set the limits. Cacao has never set the limits, and it never will.
At this point, Sarah and I transitioned to talking more directly about the nature of learning and teaching. A few months ago, I wrote a blog post on beantobarstool.com about the cycles of knowledge and confusion that accompany any dedicated effort to learn about something like beer or chocolate, particularly related to the organizational systems that have developed to make sense of both fields. Listen in as Sarah and I discuss how confusion is sometimes part of gaining knowledge. Well, I think this is an interesting spot then to bring up another conversation that we had online recently. I had written a blog post a month or two ago about the cycle of confusion and knowledge and confusion when you're trying to gain understanding of a new segment. And specifically, I was talking about coming into craft beer or into craft chocolate as a newcomer on the consumer side, and you want to figure out what's what. Both of these have just a staggering amount of complexity that can overwhelm you very quickly. One of the things that I think is great in craft beer, and one of the things that's kind of one of its values that it can offer, is there's so much variety. There's 2 different beer styles, can seem like they're not even the same beverage segment. They're so different. That's also a problem, though, when you're just trying to understand what's what and what you like. How can you possibly begin to organize this information and make sense of it? And on the chocolate side, same thing is true in more subtle ways. We usually end up doing that via origins and making statements about this origin tastes like this or like that. Both of those have value initially for helping us organize information. If you're just trying to get things into columns so you can just make sense of the information, you have to have a systematic theology for doing that. You've got to have some sort of taxonomy for breaking those apart. Once you actually get that lay of the land, though, that ends up working against you because you've put those things into a systematic structure, and then you have to undo that structure. You have to pick things apart to say, well, this is actually not as rigid as that organizational system made it. This thing here is actually maybe in between these 2 groupings, or it's its own thing outside of that. What has been your interaction with that phenomenon of learning, of like, you need systems, then you have to break the system, then you need the system again? How does that work for you?
Does it work for me? Yeah, it totally works for me because let me back it up here. I came from academia in which that kind of chaos, that kind of toing and froing, it's frustrating, right? It's frustrating. When I broke ranks, quote unquote, and I hit the ground and began to work with this crop and its producers, its stewards, in a way that I needed to, I had to very quickly become, quote unquote, comfortable with that discomfort, that kind of confusion. And I use confusion in a very, very guarded way, because it may seem like confusion to us, but there's always order in the chaos. Mm-hmm. And that is one of the things that cacao has really helped me become more willing to lean into. Stop trying to box me in. I may be in a box, depending on your fermentation vessel, but don't box me in. Yes. And so as much as there's a side of me that is always like, man, can't we just have these guidelines we can follow? Can't we just have a recipe? Can't you just be a little more logical? And then I have to stop myself in my tracks. And I put myself in the position of the tree. That's a little bit ludicrous. And, from the tree's perspective, okay, human, that's a little bit ludicrous. You telling me, how about you be a little more logical? It can't get more logical than this. You know what I'm saying? You just, as the human, you're not yet seeing it. But I'm here. I've been here for a long time. I'm going to be here for a much longer time than you. I have the patience. I will see you come to the point where you can understand this. But it's going to be a process. So for me, and this, I think this is not even an answer to your question, but it's what I can offer right now. It is all about the process and that willingness to be okay with the fact that at times I'm going to be confused by the fact that there's seemingly two opposing things, diametrically opposed ideas facing me. How could they both exist and be valid at the same time? But welcome to life. And then it'll show you it's not just two things. It may be multiple things because it may be in a full circle and you have all of these different angles from which you can see it. And they all exist and they're all true. They're all true. They all exist. It all depends on what are we after? What do we want? What is the end game? Yes. What is the end game? And that end game, like just like with video games, depending on which choices you make, you can get to the end, but that's not the only end, is it? Mm-hmm. It all depends on which choices you made, right? So for me, cacao is like this, it is this incredible labyrinth. The system in which it's embedded with all of its other companions and partners, it's a crazy, crazy multiverse. And it's simply asking me, and by extension, the rest of the human collective to, can you just pay attention for 1 minute here and stop trying to pigeonhole all of us? We're actually showing you what needs to be seen, but you're not ready yet. You're determined to impose on us what you want to see. Okay, we're here for all of it. We have time. We'll wait. Yes. So that's how I navigated, David. That's how I navigated.
What do we do on the consumer side then with the education component? Because like, is there a better way to present information for people to where we can give both order and a perspective on the chaos that kind of exists around that order? I mean, you and I think are alike in that when something has our attention, we've decided this thing will have my attention, our curiosity is going to lead us to try to learn as much about it as we can. But there are things that you and I have not decided to give our attention to, other fields. We recognize there's complexity in them, but we don't have the time to give to them. And other people are coming to chocolate, or in my career, coming to beer, who are in that position. They're not going to give the attention to it to master them. How do you give them something that helps them make sense of this without them devoting the next 5 or 10 years of their lives to weeding through all of this?
Man, that's an excellent question. That's an excellent question. And all I can say to that, David, is this. Based on what I do now, that speaks to actually that question, I tell stories. So basically what I've said to you, it tends to come at them in more of a nugget format, but along the lines of more of a story, if I see it relevant at the time of delivery. Yes? So for example, in the training scenarios that I'm normally under, whether I'm working with one individual or working with a group, we have specific things that we want to achieve with that training. Or if I'm there to help optimize a process and I want to be able to share that optimization strategy with the team that's going to have to take it forward, we have very clear-cut goals. What's our end game for this particular interaction or series of interactions? What are the most important elements that you need to know to get your job done? Yes, that helps us build and maintain some level of order, I think, which is what you're getting at, right? How do we navigate all of this chaos, all of these things we don't yet understand? Or Sarah, I'm not going to have the time for all of this amazing, rabbit hole research you're talking about, right? I just need to know, how do I get from A to Z and get a product that I can sell, that is flavorful, that is consistently so. I know how to manage. I can bring in new people and I can teach them how to do this. Yes, there are steps to do all of that. The science, the practical science allows us to do that quite well now. Yes. What I do use the opportunity to do, I relish this enormously, which is why I need to work for myself and not, an entity per se. Because when I have those training opportunities and I see the window during those training sessions to make that little shameless plug for, this is not as simple as you think it is. I want to step outside the fence a little bit so that you can understand that it is not as clean lined. It is not as A to B to C to D as we make it seem right now. I want you to know that there are other peripheral things happening here. There's a whole other cast of characters that are weighing in. There's like a shadow government at play here. Okay. I need you to understand. I don't need to go very deep, but I want you to be aware that it exists. And so that's how I do it in small, hopefully digestible bits. It remains to be seen, what other, based on the feedback from other folks, but it's always been very well received because folks have always commented on the fact that I fortunately seem to have the ability to simplify very complex things, but give them the ability to appreciate that it remains complex, but it doesn't have to be complicated, and it is not above the regular person even being exposed to remotely understanding. Because as far as I see it, David, my part of my quote unquote job, my offering in this space is that of plant that seed, have that little nugget be placed in that space. Wherever it goes, it goes. I'm not responsible for where it goes. I'm responsible for putting it there so that when it takes root or with that person, they mention it to somebody else who might be interested in going deeper with it now. It has gone where it needed to go. So that's how I do it. So I'm still able to at least walk the line of there's some order, there are ways to do this, there are steps we can follow. It's never going to be perfect because we're dealing with a highly biological dynamic system, but we understand enough to this point to allow us to manage and guide the systems in particular ways, as long as we do what should be done from the very beginning to set the system up for success. Yeah.
I really like that. And I mean, you're basically saying story as structure, like you're using storytelling as a way to make sense. I think that is what I try to do when I'm doing consumer focused education, but I had not put it directly into those words. And I think that matches, as I've been hearing you talk, there was a point earlier in our conversation when I had the thought that it sounds like you approach learning for yourself almost like you're hosting a true crime podcast. Like there was a point where you were like, and then I went back and I looked at all the evidence again and I saw something I missed the first time. You're almost using story for yourself and kind of solving crimes.
Bravo, David. Bravo. Yes, because I it's interesting that you say that, because when I in many of my training sessions, I always make reference to, folks, this is why we're collecting this data. This is why we're doing this. This is why we go back and we take a look. We're CSIing this scene, okay? Nice. So I shouldn't be surprised that you use that example, but it is true. It is very true. All of what I do is about me trying to understand, trying to decode, trying to find a way to have it make sense to me. If it makes sense to me, maybe it'll make sense to somebody else. Maybe it'll help somebody else, right? So yes, you hit the nail on the head.
Now I'm trying to figure out if there's a way to do a podcast about chocolate or beer, but do it in a true crime format. Have something you're trying to get to the bottom of and just like stringing along across several episodes. And I
think you should. I really think you should. I think you would do it quite expertly. So game on, David, game on.
I'll have to think through that one now. Story as educational structure is such a beautiful concept, and I'm so grateful to Sarah for putting that into words. I think that is what I find myself doing, both in writing and when speaking for groups, but I hadn't thought about it as being an actual educational structure for when we encounter complex information and try to translate it for others. I love that. I can't promise we'll do a true crime, beer, or chocolate podcast, but I'll give it some thought. I'd love to hear your ideas for how that might work. Thanks to Sarah for coming on the show once again. I think we can all learn from the curiosity and humility with which she approaches trying to understand something. Those traits have bones, though. They aren't content to remain at the point of confusion or surprise. They're a posture from which to interact with information, but the goal is understanding. Thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Bean to Barstool.